If you have questions, I love questions. I think that's probably the most interesting way to go. If you'd like, I can also read a little bit to you from the book. So Fencing with the King basically got its start about 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a book that's had a long germination, and some of my books are shorter. Some of them take a long, long time to kind of grow and take seed. And this one, I think in a way it started at this dinner party I was at in Amman, Jordan. I was there on a Fulbright, and the Fulbright, it's a scholarship, and it lets you go overseas to study. I was in Jordan because my father's family is from there. And when I was a kid, we'd lived there off and on when I was growing up. My father used to say to me and my sisters, now girls, this would be in the United States, don't get confused. This is what he always used to say to us. Don't get confused. Even though you're living in the United States and you dress like Americans and you talk like Americans and you look like Americans, you are Jordanian secretly. So that, of course, was incredibly confusing. And it was something he used to say to us all the time. And so when I had a chance to finally start to investigate some of my family background, I decided that the Fulbright was the way to go, that I wanted to see, how much of this was actually true. Was I really secretly Jordanian or not? So there I was at a dinner party at my uncle's house in Amman, and they were all gossiping about, the one who wasn't there, which was my father. And I have 7 uncles, and they're all huge gossips, and they were going on and on about my dad. And they were saying something in Arabic, and I can kind of understand Arabic. I speak it enough to embarrass myself. So I heard them using the phrase, the king's favorite, over and over again. And finally, I stopped my uncle, and I said, the king's favorite what? And he said, oh, your father was King Hussein's favorite fencing partner. Well, this was news to me. I didn't even know that my father knew how to fence, much less that he used to fence with King Hussein. And this sort of thing used to happen with my dad all the time. When he was a young man, he was in the Jordanian Air Force. And he got picked out of the general force to be trained in a bunch of the kingly arts, if you will. I think it's because he was so tall. He was a tall guy in a nation of short people. And so, that kind of selected him out. They were like, okay, you. He and a few of his friends, they got picked out, and they were trained in these kinds of skills. So he learned how to fence, and he was trained in polo, and he was trained in falconry, and all kinds of things that, you would never think of as being necessity for modern life. But he was given this education. And then he got to the United States, and he never talked about it. So when we were kids and growing up, this kind of thing would sort of pop up out of nowhere all the time. So I'll give you another example. I was on a dude ranch in Wyoming with my sisters. We were all kids. And I remember, we were all really nervous. We'd never ridden a horse before. We'd barely even seen a horse before. And the owner came out with his big, shiny horse. That's a technical term for equestrians, shiny horse. And he came out with this glorious thing. And my father jumped on the horse and galloped away. And I remember my mother standing there with her mouth dropped open and going like, Gus? Gus? It was just so odd and so shocking. We didn't know that he knew how to ride a horse. So I was at this party in Amman. And I had just discovered that my father had been fencing partner with King Hussein. And I thought, I've got to use this in a novel. This has got to become, something. And this happens to me, and I think to a lot of writers pretty frequently. You get an idea, and you're pretty sure you know what's going to happen. You're pretty sure you've got a roadmap. This is where I'm going to take the novel. It's going to be this glorious, swashbuckling tale of, villains and heroes and sword fights. And it kind of turned out that way, but it kind of didn't. It also turned out to be a story about identity and about the personal search for self. And how we go to places and discover these things in ourselves, how we have to go on these hunts, if you will. At the center of the novel, there is a character who he kind of walks into the novel very unexpectedly. And this was something that had happened to me in my own life. When I was 7 or 8 years old, we were all living in Jordan. This was the first time we'd moved there. And one night, my dad said to us, "Kids, get in the car. We're going on a trip." And so, Dad was always full of surprises. We got into the car and we started driving. And he took us way, way out into this sort of semi-arid area. And there were like cliff sides all around, and they were sort of riddled with caves. And he pulled over and he turned around to the back seat and he looked at us and he said, "Okay, I'm going to stop here, but don't get out of the car and don't open the windows." Okay, great. So he rolled up the window. These were the old roll-up windows. And he locked up the car, and we all sat there. It was me and my 2 younger sisters, and actually 2 of my cousins too. And we were all like ages 9 and under. And we watched him go across the desert to one of these cave openings. And he walked in front of the opening, and he started shouting something into this cave. And I remember seeing like some misty, dusty stuff coming out of the opening of the cave. And after a moment, this figure emerged. It was like this entity that came out of the cave. And it was big figure. And, my dad, he was a big guy. And this big, silhouetted figure came out and wrapped its arms around my dad and lifted him right up off of his feet. And my father was laughing, and they were swinging back and forth. And then he caught sight of us in the car, and he came lumbering over, and we had the windows all rolled up, and we were all popped up. This was really exciting. This was like, going to wildlife safari or something, keep the windows closed. And he came over and he leaned down and he's looking in, and this man, his face was all covered in dust and his hair was all covered in this white stuff. And he's looking at us and he was waving and smiling, and we were all like, "Ha!" And my dad came over and he shouts through the window, "Girls, say hello to your Uncle Samir." And we were like, "Oh, wow, cool." Oh, sorry. So it turned out that we had an uncle who lived in a cave. And this was something Dad had never talked about. He had never told us about it. He kind of dropped it on us like a fun bit of family trivia, as you do. And it became a kind of mystery. And I asked people about it, who was this uncle? How did he end up in a cave? I really never got any clear answers about it. People used to say things to me like, he took drugs. But it was very clear that he was not he didn't seem in any way altered, he seemed actually quite happy and kind of healthy and almost joyous, and he was trying to connect with us. I think Dad kept the car locked because he wasn't quite sure about Uncle Samir, and he wasn't quite sure what this guy in a cave would do. So we never actually got to hug him. But I felt like we made this really interesting and amazing connection. And I would ask my father from time to time over the years, what about Uncle Samir? Should we get him? Should we, do we leave him in this cave? What do we do? And my father, I think he actually spent a lot of time thinking about this. Samir was the youngest of the 8 boys. And I think the problem was that they realized that you couldn't take him out of his cave, that was where he wanted to be. And people told me that they would take him from the cave into town just to, entertain him. And then they would go into his cave and they would scrape down the sides, because apparently what Samir did was he would whitewash the interior walls of his cave. That was how he spent his days, whitewashing the interior of his cave to make it nice, I guess. But it would thicken the walls so much that over time, he wouldn't have enough room to move around. So they would go in, a couple times a year and scrape down the cave and make it roomy for him. This had to go in the novel, This was going in the story. And as I wrote, I understood that he was, in many ways, kind of the emotional core of the novel. He was the one that things kind of centered around. And to me, this became a story about what we lose, what we give up, as we try to create our own narratives. Who gets sacrificed, who gets left behind, and who do we get to take with us? So in the novel, there is a character who comes out of a cave, and he turns out to be very central to the novel, very important. He is based on my Uncle Samir. He's got a different name, and I give him a different story. And then, let's see, the last thing I'll tell you about is that there is a young woman at the center of the novel, and her name is Amani, and she is on a kind of quest for her identity. She finds a letter in a book that was written by her grandmother. And in my own story, my grandmother was a really interesting kind of figure to me. She was a refugee. She and her mother got separated from their family. They were living in Bethlehem, and this would have been back in the 1940s, 1950s. And the Ottoman Empire was like breaking up, and there was a lot of destruction that was happening as the army was just sort of deteriorating into guerrilla factions and just people kind of marauding and setting fire to things and stealing and just doing what they could, because the army, the soldiers were starving. So these Turkish soldiers were going through, and apparently they poisoned the well water. They did a lot of really awful things. So my grandmother and her mother were escaping with the family. They got separated. And my grandmother and her mother got into Jordan on the Hijazi Railway. Did anyone here see Lawrence of Arabia? Okay, the railway they're working on. That's the railway that my grandmother was on. It cuts through what used to be called Transjordan and goes all the way down to the Red Sea. So there they were on the railroad, and it got boarded by like Bedouins who were also looting and stealing things, and they had to escape off the front of the train. I used to hear these stories. They were so great. And my grandmother, she was 14 years old. She was dressed in this beautiful little perfect outfit that she'd had. She used to have these clothes that one of her relatives brought her from France. And she was wearing these stockings. I think they were called Lisle stockings. Does anyone know that word? Lisle. Yeah. Am I saying that right?
I think so.
Lisle stockings. Yeah. I think it was a kind of a fine knit. And these were one of her prized possessions, were these Lisle stockings. And when she got to the house, when they finally landed at the house they were aiming for, her stockings were in shreds. And this was the detail that she would return to when she told the story. She didn't talk about the marauding Bedouins, the guns, the Ottoman Empire, the poisoned wells, none of that. What she talked about were her stockings. And I thought about how that's how it is, right? Like, we can't take in everything. We can't take in those huge pictures, but what we can take in are those small items, those beautiful little pieces of our heart that appear in unexpected ways, and we don't always know how they're going to impact us. But for her, that was what she settled on. And she consoled herself by collecting books. So that was what my grandmother, in real life, that's what she ended up doing, was collecting books. She married my grandfather. I think they were 15, maybe 16. They went on to have 12 children. I know. Yeah, they were busy. And she collected these books. And anytime anyone came to the house, they knew, don't bring any food, drinks, anything like that. She wants books. And so by doing this over time, she ended up creating the first public library in Jordan out of her home. Yeah, so yay, libraries. So because of that, I wanted to keep her. She was a really important figure in the novel. And her story was the one that it kind of presides over this one. I think of her as like a guardian angel or spirit that looks out over the course of the novel and kind of informs the journey that the main character is on. So that gives you a little taste of what's going on. And if you like, would you like a little reading? Yes, you have to say that. you know. I'm going to just read a little bit to you, and it will give you a sense of sort of what the book is doing. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. How does that sound? Okay. All right. And if you want, somebody can get the hook out. And all right. Amani watched the falcon pause in midair, fold its wings, and dive. Too fast to measure, the man beside her remarked. Extraordinary things. She fanned herself with the program. This is a race? He nodded. It's the 400 meter. Under the open air warm-up tent, trainers milled around. Hooded falcons balanced on leather gloves, showing off. The birds looked heavy and monumental, like imperial beings. Amani and Gabe were allowed to watch from the warm-up tent. There were photographers, wealthy tourists in suits. Servers with trays walked through a sea of conversation. Amani accepted a glass of something transparent. It smelled grassy and tasted light in her mouth. She would have given her last dollar for an ice cube. Somewhere on the risers under the sun, amid a sea of white dish dashes, sat the king. Don't they believe in water? Her father asked. They? Hafez looked bemused. Someone edged in front of Amani and took a picture of her uncle. All day and all night in those airplanes, it's like crossing the Sahara, Gabe said. I'm well aware. Hafez lowered his nose to the glass. This vintage is from the Palace Sommelier. He looked in the direction of the royal entourage. If there's time, later I'll introduce you to the king. He smoothed back his shock of white hair. On the competition field, a man in jeans, t-shirt, and red keffiyeh jogged backwards across the swept ground, swinging bait on a long tether. What's that thing? Amani pointed. Fill me in here. Feathers, her father said. It's feathered incentive. The falcon flashed past the bait. It flew in a narrow ellipsis, returned for another attempt. The man lowered the bait and swung it along the earth before the bird descended. It's duck wing, the man beside her said, and that field, it's now falcon territory. Wind rumbled along the roof of the tent. The man's brown eyes had a green light to them. He took something from a boy and offered it to Amani, a little paper cup of tepid water. She thanked him, swallowed it in one gulp, and gave a second cup to her father. No, no, Hafez shooed the boy. Don't drink that. He's getting that from the animal hose. Hafez gestured to someone in the crowd, and minutes later his driver appeared with frosted glass bottles of Evian. 500 dinar donation to get into the trainer's tent, and they can't give us decent water. Falcon-oriented discussions circulated all around. She heard that Sheikh Majid had bought out first class on Emirate Air to fly his 80 falcons to Jordan on the arms of their trainers, the Abu Dhabi Falconers Club. The birds had needed passports to travel internationally. It's required to protect against smuggling, one of the trainers said. It's easier for a falcon to get a UAE passport than it is for me. Behind him, a silk banner rippled, inscribed in Arabic, in commemoration of the 60th birthday of King H of Jordan. She swiped an arm across her forehead. Her eyes felt gritty. Heat warped the air, and she couldn't shake the sense that the ground was creeping under her feet. They were at a desert camp in Al Mafraq, 68 kilometers north of Amman, on the edge of the Jordan Valley. Ivory-colored swells of dust filled the air, hitting the back of her sinuses. She felt as if she had walked through fiery curtains to get here. Throughout their long trip, her father had sat gray-faced, pale with sweat. She thought he was anxious about flying, but he looked the same today. They'd landed in Amman at 2 a.m. Then Hafez arrived at 9, banging on the front door, calling, "I'm here." He had plans. He'd walked in and clapped his arms around his youngest brother. "And your lovely wife, we won't be seeing her?" "It's her busy time," Amani said. "School started last month." "You Americans, you know what they say," he smiled broadly. "Arabs have family, Americans have work." She smiled a little, uncertain if she should feel hurt or flattered. Driving to the falconry exhibition, they'd passed hillsides scattered with low buildings, roadside vegetable markets, beige cinder blocks. The entire country appeared to be under construction. "Welcome to Jordan in October," her uncle said. Amani wanted to crawl back into bed, but her uncle was an undeniable force. 30 years I don't see my favorite niece unless I take 3 airplanes to get to New York, he said. Now it's my turn. One of the trainers approached Amani. He held an immense gray falcon on his forearm. Its merciless eyes like onyx and his flattened head made Amani think of griffins. It clicked its curved beak open, then closed, shifting its black enamel talons on the glove. The trainer spoke little English, but he held out his bird, and Amani understood he thought she might like to pet it. She pointed to herself. "Me?" Hafez chuckled. "Be careful, they smell fear." "Your grandfather owned a falcon," Gabe told her. "He did." She glanced at the gray bird. "You never told me." "Several, actually," Hafez said. "But this one, it was devoted to him. He always said that falcons aren't affectionate, but that bird, it was a good bird. It let me stroke its head. I wrapped my hand up with a dish rag and carried him around." "Ugly as a buzzard," Hafez said. A couple of the trainers started talking to Gabe, gesturing. He lowered his head. Hafez cut in with some remark, and Gabe lifted his eyes. He stopped laughing. The men looked at Hafez. Amani turned to the speckled falcon and tentatively lifted the back of her finger to its breast. Under its feathers, she felt the soft tap of its heart. Gabe started walking out to the competition area. Dad? Amani stepped forward. Hey, Dad, where are you going? She and the trainer went to the edge of the tent where sunlight fell in a sharp slant. The temperature had risen steadily. The seats were emptying. I don't think you're supposed to be out there. The man with flecked eyes also moved to the tent's edge. What's he doing? Brother, are you lost? Hafez yelled. He was smiling, but he stopped. Amani felt a twinge of uneasiness. Out on the field, someone handed Gabe a creased leather glove. He slipped it on his left hand. A trainer with an amber-colored falcon came to the start of the field and waved to Gabe. He released his bird and it flapped to the flagpole. It landed, its head ticking with tiny movements. Gabe raised his glove, gave a whistle, but the bird remained in place. Gabe lifted the glove again, holding his arm out. He shook it a few times. His index finger curved and gave another whistle. With a sound like snapping sheets, the falcon lifted from its perch, sailed, talons outstretched, and landed on Gabe's hand. Amani clapped, startled and delighted. Look, you're Baba, the trainer said, his own falcon ruffling. It's in the blood, the man said. The history, the birds sent it. They know he's a real Bedouin. Her father was laughing. Someone whistled. He tossed the bird in the air and it swooped back toward its trainer. Her uncle had clapped as well, but then crossed his arms. There was an empty section in the risers where the king had been seated. When she was a child, she'd like to imagine that suave Uncle Hafez was her actual father. He recited poetry and spoke with presidents and traveled the world. Oh, she did love her father, but Gabe kept to his workshop, and he barely knew how to read English. Uncle Hafez did marvelous things, helping to govern a kingdom and steering the world in the direction of peace. And he spoke up for all sorts of dispossessed people. When Amani was in college and worried about what to major in, he told her, follow your voice. You love to write, yes? So you will do that. Now she watched her father with the birds. People, even parents, could continually surprise you. She sensed the tilting pull between the brothers. Was this what it was like to have a sibling? She trotted out to claim her dad. Gabe smiled, shaking his head. Then he halted, his eyes lifting above Amani. His lips parted, his expression stopped. Amani slowed down. An instant later, she heard wings and uproar of feathers. She turned to see two slim black talons extended. She shrieked, lifting her arms, the bird's grand wings outstretched, beating furiously as if to carry her away. The trainer sprinted over, shouting in Arabic, and grabbed his bird, but two welts were torn through her cotton shirt and into her shoulder. She tried to catch her breath, to laugh, but when she saw a bright crimson streak run down her arm, her knees buckled. I'm not supposed to be here, she thought as she hit the ground. I shouldn't have come. Then the other one was at her side, the man who'd talked to her, lifting her head a little, pressing a bandage to her shoulder. My God, I've never seen one of them do that before. It was like you'd called to it. She tried to make a joke. Did I call it to come eat me? Whatever you were saying, he said, the bird heard you. And I'll stop there. That's a little sample for you. Thank you. I'd love it if maybe you had some questions, or we could talk about writing or what you're reading or any of that good stuff. Or when I came to this country, well, I was born here. Yeah, I lived in the States until I was 7. We moved to Jordan. I was 7 to 9 in Jordan. We came back to the States. We went when I was 12. We were only there for a few months. And then again when I was 14. And each time we went for slightly less time, because my father had this completely idealized idea of what Jordan was going to be. He thought it was going to be just like he remembered it from his childhood, which was glorious, and there was nothing wrong and nothing bad ever happened when he was a kid. And then we'd get there and he would be faced with the reality. Yeah. Which is a bummer.
Was your brother Jordanian also?
My mom is Irish Catholic. So, yes. And, I think it was tough for her. I mean, they were so young when they got married. They were like, she was 20 and I think he was 21 or 22. So they were still finding out who they were, as people, as individuals. And I think what they ended up doing was they kind of struck a deal where they stayed in this country, but they tried to make our household as Jordanian as possible. So, we listened to my father's music. We had the food. He was a really talented chef, and he did all the Middle Eastern cooking. All their friends, their socializing was all around the Middle East, and a lot of expats from other countries as well. So they created, as much as they could, a Jordanian / international household, but they kept it in the United States as much as they could. And then every now and then, Dad would get a wild hair and be like, no, it's time to move back. It's time to move back. We're going to create a new reality. This is a big mistake. We weren't supposed to stay in the United States, and we're going home. And then we'd go home. We'd go back to Jordan, and Dad would immediately start complaining. He would be like, the food isn't any good here. The elevators don't run. The Jordanians aren't as cute as the Americans. I mean, whatever he could think of, it wasn't as good as back in the United States. And, you can imagine how popular that made him among the Jordanians. So he would go back to Jordan, alienate everyone, get into a million fights, and then we'd end up moving back to the States. And that was kind of his pattern for much of his adult life, I would say, until he retired. When he retired, he took an early retirement. He retired when he was 55. And that, I think, was when he really made the decision of what he was going to give himself to. And he decided on the United States. He finally decided that this is where he was going to be. All his other brothers, at some point in their journey, they came to the United States for their education. Some of them started their families and careers here, but all his brothers ended up moving back to Jordan. He was the only one who stayed. So, yeah.
You realize you've got a genealogical story.
Yes.
I do genealogy, that's why I was listening. You do have a genealogical story, which is great.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's I find it fascinating. I really do. And it's such a big family, and it's got its fingers in all kinds of aspects of Jordanian life, and it's really kind of fun to look at those personalities and the ancestry. Yes, yeah. So. Yeah, genealogy is really a fascinating thing, isn't it? Yeah.
What did your dad do that he was able to move back?
Quit a lot. That's that's what he did. He wanted to cook. That's what he wanted. His big dream was to own his own restaurant, and he kept trying to put together deals where he would find different restaurants and different properties, and he would try to get his brothers to go in on it with him. He had this idea that he had to get everyone together, and I think that was maybe his big mistake, actually. He always had to get the investors lined up, and inevitably it would all fall apart. And so basically he took jobs, he took gigs, he worked as a bailiff in a court, he worked selling carpets. The longest running job he had was as a manager in a hospital. And, he wasn't really suited for being the manager of the hospital, but that's what he did. And he accidentally it's kind of a funny story. He, he was Muslim, and he didn't really, his family, a lot of his family is Christian actually too. It's a mixed family, but he didn't really grow up with Christmas. But they asked him one year, somebody thought it would be fun to ask Dad if he would be Santa Claus for the children's wing. And they gave him the suit, and he loved it. And he went around through the children's wing, and he was a huge hit. And this word got out that Gus Abu Jaber was this amazing Santa Claus. And so he started to get hired by all these different hospitals, and he would go around for the month of December from hospital to hospital to hospital visiting the children's wards. And it was so hilarious because I don't think anyone knew that their Santa Claus was Muslim, but he was. And he didn't even really know how to be Santa Claus. Like, he didn't get the ho 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 thing. He would kind of go like ho ho ho, like ho ho ho. And he would give a speech. Like, he thought that Santa Claus gave speeches. So he would make up these speeches about, I remember he gave a speech on the difference between men and women one time. It was like, the speech about the nature of reality. He would just hold forth with these speeches. And it kind of became a whole second job for him. That his Santa Claus career really eclipsed his hospital management career. And then when he finally retired, they tried to get him to keep doing it. But he, how did he get this money? Oh, my mother inherited some money. Dad finally bought his restaurant. And it was a mini golf course putt-putt family recreation center that had a little shack on it where it was like a little greasy spoon for hot dogs and hamburgers and french fries and stuff like that. Dad bought this whole thing, this whole family putt-putt recreation center so he could have the little shack. And he moved in there and he transformed it into a place that had hot dogs, hamburgers, french fries, and falafel and shawarma and tabbouleh. And he offered this kind of crazy miasma, but it was wildly popular and people would line up down the block for his food. So in the end, he finally did get to have his dream for a while. And then he ended up retiring to Pompano Beach. So,
What
yes.
state did you live in when you lived in the United States?
We lived in New York, in Syracuse, in central New York. And that my father counted that among his many misfortunes in life, that he had landed in Syracuse. But, that's where he met my mother. So, go figure. Well, it's a funny thing. There was a kind of international community around Syracuse University. And so for a time, it was kind of fun and lively and lots of different people from different countries. I think when my dad first came to this country, he landed in Queens. And he was in one of those little shared apartments. Like, I think they had like 2 beds and among 10 people, and they would sleep in, rotation and stuff like that. And then when he finally got up to Syracuse, he said he went in the summer. And he said, the greenery, the trees, he was so in love with it. And then by the time the winter had happened, he'd bought a house and fallen in love. So it was too late. Yeah, too late to leave, too late to escape Syracuse. Yeah. So that's sort of the tale, if you will. Yes?
Were you able to piece your dad's history ever, or is it still just things that are missing?
I think there's always going to be mystery. I mean, I learned a lot. When I was in Jordan, I was able to uncover a lot of pieces of the past and where we had come from. Part of the problem with this kind of family history is when you have people in diaspora, they leave so much behind. So, like, I never met any of my grandmother's family. I don't think she didn't reunite with her father or her brothers until she was, long married and had many children. It had been years and years until she reunited with the rest of her family. And a lot of them passed on before they, reconnected. I have heard from her younger sister who lives in Ireland. And that's been really interesting. And she changed her name to Camellia Angel. I don't know why. But she has been filling me in on different kinds of pieces of the family history. And, one of the really interesting things that happened is that one of my uncles, who is also, you may have noticed there's this Uncle Hafez in the start of the novel. He is based on one of my uncles. And this uncle was a problematic figure. He always felt like he'd been cheated in some way. Even though he'd gotten the best education, he was illustrious, he had traveled the world, he'd won all kinds of awards. He was on the king's cabinet. He was a senior advisor to King Hussein. If anyone, if you're interested, you can Google, I think it's Dan Rather. My uncle, his name was Kamil, Kamil, which actually means perfect in Arabic, Uncle Perfect. Kamil Abu Jaber, you can Google him and you can see some old clips of him being interviewed by Dan Rather and people like that. So he was very illustrious, but he always felt like he'd been cheated. And isn't it so interesting? The people who have the most are the ones who feel like they have the least sometimes. And he was obsessed with this knife that my father had inherited. My dad had taken care of his father when he was dying, and he had cooked for him the whole time that he was dying and nursed him and saw to him. And so when my grandfather died, he left my dad this knife, and it not a very exciting knife, just a sort of drab silver knife. My uncle was obsessed with this knife, obsessed with it. And he did everything he could to try to steal the knife back. And my dad would hide it, and he would keep it on him, and he would wear it. He'd do everything he could to safeguard this knife against my uncle. And when I was growing up, I can remember my uncle coming to visit us, traveling from Jordan, and his family, his kids, and us, and we'd all be in the back, and we'd be having a barbecue and having a great time. And at some point during the visit, he would say, "Gus, where's the knife?" And it was something that haunted him his entire life, trying to get that knife back. And you know that if he'd gotten the knife, he still wouldn't have been happy. It was just an idea to him, but it was something that tormented him. And when my dad passed on, I inherited the knife. Yes.
It sounds like your father was very dominant in the family. And I'm just curious how your Irish Catholic mother assimilated into this group, because it sounds very problematic for her.
It was yes, that's a good way to put it. Well, I'll tell you, I have this memory of my uncles and my father. They would sit around the dinner table. Inevitably, they'd all be over for dinner. And we'd be done eating, and they would start talking and telling stories and reminiscing. And my mom, she would get up and start collecting the dishes, and she would say, And now the Arabs will tell their stories. And then she would go to the sink and she'd go, and the Irish Catholic will do the dishes. And I can remember thinking, you want to be the one who tells the stories. So, I mean, I think it was hard. It was kind of chaotic, but I think it also gave her a kind of energy as well. She studied Arabic, you know, she devoted herself to learning the language, because when they met, he really didn't speak English. And she knew she liked him, so she studied Arabic and he studied English. She became really interested in the dance styles and the music, and after Dad passed on, she became a very prolific painter. And her paintings express a lot of the Middle Eastern sensibility. There's a lot of the sense of design work. You know, she studied a lot of the history. And so I feel like it was tough. And I think they struggled a lot, and there was a lot of push-pull about where to live and how to raise the kids and who to be. But by the same token, I think they both got so much from each other. And yeah, they, you know, and they were together for well over 50 years. So yeah, they made it work. I guess that's making it work, right? Yeah, 52 years, that's a good run. Yeah. Well, and thank you so much for coming out. Oh, thank you, you guys.